So you know how some of my videos are done at least partly because I feel a sense of duty to tell people about things that I feel they should know about? Yeah, this one's different. This one I'm doing purely for my own nerdy indulgence about the motorsport that I love, and I hope that you'll join me along for the ride. You've all seen the thumbnail and title of the video. I'm of course talking about Formula 1. This is the start of a new series, my F1 Retrospective. I'm going to talk about every single season of Formula 1, year by year, in the hopes of creating one great big story. Why? Well, because I feel the history of the sport is one of its most important aspects, and in recent years, F1's seen a massive surge in popularity, especially in the United States, through the Netflix series Drive to Survive. I've also noticed that a lot of these new fans can be very toxic as they've all come from other sports like football or basketball, and as such they often behave like fans of those sports. They have their favourite team and everyone else can piss off. Such attitudes can be harmless, but when it comes to cheering when drivers have massive accidents, being extremely childish, and in some cases actively wishing harm to other drivers, it's simply not acceptable. I feel that a lot of this stems from an ignorance of the history of the sport. Many of these fans are so new that they never even saw the likes of Mark Webber race. To me, Mark Webber was a staple of Grand Prix racing when I grew up in the early 2010s. But to most of these new fans, he's just, oh yeah, that's Oscar Piastri's manager. However, not all of these new fans are this tribal. Some of them are just new racing fans, something that we all were at some point in our journey. And it's mostly them that I want this series to appeal to. I want this series to be accessible, so that if you're a nerd like me, a casual fan, or someone who's never watched F1 in their lives, you can learn something and come to appreciate how amazing the sport really is. So join me as we go back over 70 years into the past. Although actually, before we do that, we have to go back even further. In 1885, a German engineer named Karl Benz built what is widely considered to be the first car, the Benz Patent Motorwagen. It was essentially just a seat with an engine, and it only had three wheels. It had a single-cylinder 1-litre engine developing two-thirds of a horsepower. Yeah, less than 1 horsepower. Clearly the speed could be improved, and sure enough, within a decade of the car's invention, some people are already thinking, hey, why don't we race these things? But these people weren't the Germans, they were the French. In 1894, they began holding the first ever motor races. However, they didn't carry the name Grand Prix, as these races were more like rallies that took place from town to town rather than on a closed circuit. The term Grand Prix would not be used until 1906. The French grabbed this achievement too. The race, which was held on an early version of what we now know today as Le Mans, was the first to take place on a closed circuit. The circuit, however, was very long, 65 miles per lap in fact, and it took the cars about an hour to complete each lap. Racing in this period was much more nationalistic. Rather than today, where the teams are plastered with commercial sponsors, each nation would have their own team, as well as their own colours. In a way, you raced for your country as opposed to a team. There was also no overarching championship of sorts yet, it was just a mismatch of various races that took place throughout the year. Similarly, there was basically no concept of a universal rulebook yet either. Regulations changed from country to country and thus from race to race, and they were very, very loose. There was no limit on engine size, for example. Basically, if it had an engine and could seat human beings, you could race it. However, one trend was established even back then, it still endures to this day: innovation. This Grand Prix was run by a Renault, and a large part of this victory came from the fact that they had detachable wheel rims, which doesn't sound like much today, but it meant that they could change tyres without having to remove the tyre from the rim, and given the state of the roads, this ultimately saved them a lot of time. Innovation continued and the cars got faster and faster, and domination passed from nation to nation. The French initially dominated, followed by the Italians, followed by Nazi Germany. However, their domination of racing was short-lived, because shortly after they rose to the top, World War II happened, and the world had more important things to do than watch rich aristocrats kill themselves in coffins on wheels. I don't get it, personally. Interestingly, the term Formula One existed before our story begins. However, much like before the war, there was no overarching championship. This changed, however, at the end of 1949 when the FIA, the sports governing body, announced that for 1950 they would be linking several of the national races together to form what they called the World Championship of Drivers. And so our story begins. Formula One at this time was weird. In some ways it was almost unrecognisable to the sport today. Almost everything was different. I'll give further details when necessary, but to summarise, there were only 7 races compared to the 20-odd that we have today. The point system was different, the cars had no sponsors, no aerodynamic appendages, no computer gizmos, no seatbelts. The engine wasn't even in the same place. In fact, it's not too far-fetched to say that the only similarity between a 1950 Formula One race and a modern one is that somebody won at the end. The first race was to take place in Britain, at Silverstone. That name will be familiar to a modern F1 fan because Silverstone is still in use today. However, the Silverstone that would play host to the F1's first ever race looked like this. It's hardly the same as today, huh? It does look a little strange, but there's a very good reason for this. Silverstone, like many historic British racetracks, for that matter, was built from one of the various tarmacs and perimeter roads that were World War II airfields. But enough about architecture, it's time to talk about racing cars. 22 cars were entered to the event, most of them still being pre-war designs. The three big players were the Turbolaggos, the Maseratis, and the Alfa Romeos. But of these, there was no question of which one was the top dog. The Alfa Romeo 158 was perhaps one of the most successful racing cars ever made. Of the 54 races it entered, it won 47 of them. So perhaps it wasn't to be expected when the four Alfa Romeos promptly took the first four places on the grid in qualifying. The Italian Giuseppe Farina took pole position, followed by his countryman Luigi Fagioli, Argentine Juan Manuel Fangio and Brit Reg Parnell. And yes, Prince Biro was an actual prince, he was a member of the Tyrrell family. On race day, 200,000 people turned up to see a good 70-lap race. What they really saw, however, was the Alphas streaking off into the distance while everybody else fought to not be left behind. Farina, Fagioli and Fangio took off into the lead, and in the opening laps they swapped positions regularly, presumably to keep the crowd amused. However, on lap 62, Fangio retired with a broken oil pipe. This left Farina to take the checkered flag and become Farina's first ever F1 race winner, 2 seconds ahead of Fagioli, with Parnell a distant third. In 1950, the points were awarded to the top 5 finishers on an 8-6-4-3-2 basis. The Turbolaggos of Yves Giraud Cabantus and Louis Rosier finished 4th and 5th respectively. A bonus point was also awarded to the driver who set the fastest lap during the race, and this point went to Farina. Not finishing a race was much more common in these days due to the poor reliability of the cars, and in fact, of the 21 starters that started the race, only 11 were classified as finished. The next race took place on the streets of Monte Carlo, one of F1's most famous venues, both past and present. The race also saw the arrival of F1's most famous team, Ferrari. 3 works Ferraris were on the grid, driven by Italians Alberto Ascari and Luigi Vioresi, as well as the Frenchman Raymond Sommer. There was also a privately entered car belonging to Peter Whitehead. Qualifying in Monaco was different than the other races. Instead of a single qualifying session that everyone competed in, there was a first qualifying session featuring all the drivers, followed by a second session that was essentially a shootout between the fastest 5 drivers from the first session. So when all was said and done, Fangio took pole, Farina made it an Alfa Romeo 1-2, Jose Frolian Gonzalez was the highest placed non-Alfa in third, while Filippo Tonsolin put in a great performance to qualify 4th. Fagioli in the third Alfa lined up 5th, while the 3 works Ferraris of Vioresi, Ascari and Sommer lined up 6th, 7th and 9th respectively. Hometown hero Louis Chiron slotted into 8th, while Louis Rosier rounded out the top 10. Race day wasn't exactly the smoothest affair. 2 of the 21 drivers didn't even start the race. Alfredo Paer because of an accident during practice, and Peter White had engine issues. So 19 cars took the start. However, 9 of them would be wiped out by the end of the first lap. See, Monaco's a street circuit, and part of it goes along the harbour. And on the first lap, there was a huge wave that flooded a large section of the track, causing a massive pile-up. Fangio escaped, but behind him chaos ensued. Farina, Fagioli, Rosier, Robert Manson, Tuono de Graffenried, Maurice Trintignant, Couth Harrison, Franco Roll, and Harry Schell were all out on the spot. By some miracle, nobody was injured, and back in those days there was no such thing as a safety car, so the race just carried on as normal. Gonzalez in the Maserati had picked up damage from the collision and attempted to continue, but he crashed on the following lap. The car then burst into flames. He survived, but did still receive some burns. 2 more cars retired before the end of the race, meaning that only 7 drivers saw the checkered flag. Alberto Ascari managed to stay out of trouble and make his way to second, followed by Louis Chiron, who became the first and only Monegasque driver to score points until Charles Leclerc scored his first points in 2018. However, this race belonged entirely to Fangio, as he achieved the first ever Grand Slam in F1 history. Grand Slam refers to when a driver takes pole position, sets the fastest lap in the race, and wins the race, having led every single lap. Fangio was unstoppable. 2 seconds faster than everybody else in qualifying, fastest lap, won the race an entire lap ahead of everybody else, having led every single lap. Domination is an understatement. This result, combined with Farina's non-finish, meant that he and Fangio sat at the top of the table with 9 points apiece, while Fagioli's retirement meant that he dropped to third. I am not talking about the Indy 500. It was a pointless addition to the calendar. It was run entirely to different rules, and basically none of the Indy drivers competed in any other F1 race, and almost none of the regular drivers ever did the 500, so therefore I won't be talking about it. Heading into the next race in Switzerland, there were hopes that one of the Ferraris would be able to topple the dominant Alfa Romeos. The boys from Maranello had brought updated suspension designs, as well as a double overhead camshaft engine and a 4-speed gearbox. I know that sounds mundane today, but trust me, back then, that was hot stuff. It didn't seem to pay off, however, in qualifying, as the Ferraris of Vioresi and Ascari lined up 4th and 5th, while the Alfas took 1st, 2nd and 3rd, with Fangio on pole, followed by Farina and Fagioli. But there was still hope that the Ferraris could put up a decent fight during the race. So did they? No. Ascari managed to get amongst the Alfas briefly, but then just as quickly dropped back again, and then both cars conked out before 10 laps had even been completed. Something that never changed, eh? With both the Ferraris out of the way, a complete Alfa Romeo podium looked imminent. Fagioli was unable to keep up with Farina and Fangio. Farina had overtaken Fangio towards the start, but had then been repassed. On lap 19, the Tabulago of Eugene Martin crashed heavily, throwing him from the car and injuring him in the process. Farina eventually made it by Fangio again on lap 24, then on lap 32, Fangio's engine blew, leaving Farina to cruise home with Fagioli in second. Fangio's misfortune, combined with the retirements of the Ferraris, meant that the Tabulago of Louis Rosier, who had frankly been nowhere all weekend, managed to inherit a third-place finish. The Maseratis of Prince Bira and Felice Bonotto rounded out the point scorers. Farina took the point for fastest lap. This result left Farina sitting pretty at the top of the table with a 6-point lead over Fagioli, while Fangio languished down in third due to 2 retirements in 3 races, an activity which yields no points. Only 14 cars turned up for the next race in Belgium, with most of them being works entries from the manufacturers, as the rising cost of the season priced out many of the privateers. And while this race did take place at Spa-Francorchamps, a name familiar to most modern F1 fans, Spa in these days was very, very different. It was a 14-kilometre behemoth winding through the public roads of the Ardennes forest, and to put it bluntly, it was a total death trap. There were no barriers. If you crashed, there was nothing to stop you from ending up in a tree, or a ditch, or someone's potting shed. What's more, the apex of one of the corners was just some guy's driveway. Racing at Spa then was brave by even 1950 standards. Qualifying for the race saw the same pattern of the season repeat itself again. Farina and Fangio were in a league of their own, with Farina besting Fangio this time. Fagioli was a distant third, while Vioresi was once again the lead Ferrari in fourth, while Ascari was down in seventh, seemingly drowning among a sea of Tabulagos. On race day, the Alfas sped off into the distance, and while the Ferraris and Raymond Sommer in one of the Tabulagos battled behind them. However, the Alfas had to stop to refuel, leaving Sommer in the unlikely position of being race leader. Could an upset be on the cards? No, because soon after his engine suddenly remembered that it was French and decided to go on strike. The Ferraris then also had to stop for fuel, leaving the Alfas back in the lead, with Fangio leading Farina and Fagioli. However, in the closing laps, Farina suffered transmission troubles. He finished the race, but he did drop behind both Fagioli and the Tabulago of Louis Rosier. Ascari finished fifth. At least Farina limited the damage slightly by still securing the bonus point for fastest lap. Now the battle at the top looked closer, with Farina on 22 points, Fagioli on 18 and Fangio on 17. The Works Ferraris turned up to the next race in France with a new car. However, it didn't race, as the team withdrew both cars after practice. This meant that basically the only potential challenge to the Alfa Romeos was going to be one of the army of Tabulagos. As expected, the Alfa Romeos lined up 1, 2, 3 in qualifying. Fangio took pole ahead of Farina and Fagioli. Race day would prove to be a challenge for the cars. The circuit that was used for the race, which is near Reims, was a very power-dependent circuit. This combined with the hot French summer weather would prove to be a real challenge for the car's engines. As the race got underway, Farina immediately jumped Fangio and went into the lead. Fangio would eventually pass him again on lap 16, while behind him the track was already starting to break many of the cars. 10 of the 19 starters had retired within the first 20 laps, all with blown engines or overheating issues. Things then went from bad to worse for Farina in the closing stage of the race as his fuel pump failed, causing him to retire. This left Fangio to cruise home, followed by Fagioli. Due to the high rate of attrition, the privateer Ferrari of Peter Whitehead managed to finish in third, despite starting 18th. I also feel like I should explain this. How can two drivers share the same car? You can't do that. Well, today you can't, but back then it was perfectly allowed for somebody to take over your car for whatever reason. And in the event that both cars ended up scoring points, the points were divided between the two drivers. This meant that both Philippe Tonsolin and Eugene Chaboud both scored 1 point apiece for their fifth place finish. Farina's DNF was a heavy blow to his title hopes as he dropped to third, while Fangio's third win of the season meant that he took over at the top, while Fagioli was proving that consistency often brings results, as he sat second despite not winning a single race so far. This result meant that all three drivers went into the final round at Monza with a mathematical chance of becoming champion. This was it. Three drivers gunning for the crown of F1's first ever champion. There were many different ways that the race could play out in order for each driver to win, but to simplify, Fangio was in the best position. A win or a second place finish would mean that he was champion regardless of whatever happened to everybody else. Farina needed to be on the podium to even have a chance of winning the championship, while Fagioli needed to win and take the fastest lap, and then just pray that everything went wrong for everybody else. Fangio took pole position. Farina, for once, did not join him on the front row. Instead, it was the Ferrari of Roberto Ascari, equipped with a brand new and bigger engine, that managed to split the Alfa Romeos. As such, Farina would start third, not great, but not hopeless. Fagioli, however, didn't help his faint title hopes by qualifying down in fifth, behind his new works teammate Consalvo Senesi. However, on race day, Farina would put in the drive of his life, jumping Fangio and Ascari off the start to lead. This still wasn't going to be easy with both of them in pursuit, but unlike in France, Lady Luck was on his side. Ascari briefly took the lead, however shortly after he did, his engine came over all Italian and properly broke, and 2 laps later, Fangio's gearbox failed. Championship secured? Well, not immediately. Ascari took over the car of one of his teammates and Fangio did the same, and then both went back on the charge. However, only 10 laps later, Fangio would break down again, this time with an engine failure. Farina would therefore be left to cruise to victory. Ascari put up a valiant effort, but it still wasn't enough. He finished second, sharing the points with his teammate Dorino Serafini. Fagioli came home in third, followed by the Tabulagos of Rosier and Atonsolin. Fun little trivia bonus about this race, that 5th place finish for Atonsolin made him the oldest F1 point scorer ever. He was 53. And so, Giuseppe Farina was crowned F1's first ever champion. 3 points ahead of Fangio and 6 ahead of Fagioli. Now I know what you're probably asking, but what do the numbers in brackets mean? Well, it's the result of an old rule that F1 used to have. Basically, even though there were only 7 races, only the best 4 counted towards each championship. Normally this wouldn't be an issue due to poor reliability, but Fagioli actually got pretty lucky and was able to finish 5 races that year, 4 in second and 1 in third. So as a result, his third place finish at Monza wasn't counted towards his points total. So yes, technically he scored more points than Fangio and should have finished second in the championship, but he didn't. Okay, look, I'm not going to try and justify this. The rule was dumb and they did eventually get rid of it. Eventually. So that was the first ever season of Formula 1. I hope I can make it at least a little interesting because, to be honest, it wasn't. I would give this season a C tier ranking. But every sport has to start somewhere, and there were still questions heading into 1951. Would Fangio be able to topple Farina? Could Alfa Romeo sustain their dominance? Or would some other team like Ferrari rise up and take their place? Join me next time to find out.